Sometimes history doesn't begin with a gunshot. Sometimes it begins with a silence so heavy that ordinary people can feel it pressing against their skin. In the early days after Tanzania's 2025 election, that silence stretched across the continent like a warning. Market women in Arusha, taxi drivers in Dodoma, fishermen along the coast, they all felt it even before the headlines appeared. A quiet that didn't feel peaceful. A quiet that felt like something was about to break. And then came the African Union statement. At first glance, it looked like every other diplomatic message: warm congratulations to President Samia Suluhu Hassan for her re-election. Courteous language, familiar promises of unity. But buried between those polished lines was a sentence that shook people who understood Africa's political code. The AU deeply regrets the loss of life following the election. To the untrained eye, that sounds like sympathy. To Africans, it sounds like a confession. Because the AU never mentions death unless the truth has already leaked through the cracks. Tanzania, once the quiet proof that stable democracy was possible, was suddenly facing protests, arrests, internet blackouts, and whispers of mass graves from Arusha to Mwanza. A nation once known for calm had begun to tremble, and the AU's split-tone message, half celebration, half mourning, forced a question no one wanted to say out loud. If the African Union is congratulating with one hand while grieving with the other, what really happened in Tanzania's election? And deeper still, if a country long seen as Africa's safe example can fall into crisis, how many other nations are standing on the same fragile ground? Before we continue, make sure you stay with me. What you're about to hear shapes not only Tanzania's future, but the future of how Africa defines truth, democracy, and accountability. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told honestly and without fear, feel free to like this video and share it so more people can understand what's really unfolding behind the official statements. If you ask older Tanzanians to describe the days following the 2025 election, many won't start with the politics. They'll start with the sounds. The sudden absence of children playing in the alleys of Dar es Salaam. The distant rumble of trucks moving long after midnight. The echo of footsteps in neighborhoods that were usually lively. Ordinary life had paused, not because the people chose to, but because the air itself had changed. For decades, Tanzania was the country others pointed to when they argued that Africa could be peaceful without suppressing its people. Julius Nyerere's legacy of unity, restraint, and steady leadership had shaped generations. Elections came and went, sometimes tense, sometimes flawed, but never explosive. That was why the 2025 election began with confidence. Voters lined up early in Moshi, Morogoro, and Dodoma, many young, many hopeful, eager to shape their country's future. No one imagined what would come next. But as the ballots were counted, rumors began to spread. First, quietly, whispers among poll workers, short text messages, hurried phone calls. In some towns, sealed ballot boxes arrived strangely heavy. In others, opposition representatives were blocked from entering tallying centers. A few journalists reported intimidation by local security officers who told them to stop asking unnecessary questions. These were warning signs that the election was already slipping into a place Tanzania was not familiar with. When the results were announced, something snapped. Young people were the first to react. Thousands, many voting for the first time, poured into the streets, waving flags, shouting slogans, demanding clarity. They weren't calling for violence, they were calling for answers. They didn't want to burn the country. They wanted to save the dignity of their vote. Then came the gunfire. Videos flooded social media within hours, shared by trembling hands and shaky cameras. Police swinging batons at unarmed civilians. Tear gas rolling through neighborhoods where mothers were cooking dinner. A boy barely old enough to shave carried away by officers whose faces were hidden behind black helmets. Smoke rising from burning tires. Journalists dragged away while trying to document what they saw. Tanzania, the Tanzania that the world once praised for peace, was bleeding. The most chilling reports came at dawn. Residents in Arusha described seeing trucks heading toward forested edges of the city. In Mwanza, women whispered about hurried night burials. In Dodoma, a local teacher said entire streets were blocked off without explanation. By evening, human rights groups began circulating claims of mass graves. Arusha, Mwanza, Dodoma, Mara, Kitavi, Moshi. Whether all of these were confirmed or not, the fear was real. Fear always appears first in the places where truth is hardest to find. And then in the middle of this chaos, the AU released its statement congratulating President Samia Suluhu Hassan. On paper, it looked calm, almost soothing. diplomatically crafted, polished, predictable. But to the people burying loved ones, it sounded like applause at a funeral. Tanzanians reacted instantly. "You congratulate while we bury our brothers," one activist wrote online. Another posted, "If the AU sees this as normal, then who will speak for us?" The AU's statement, intended to bring calm, only deepened suspicion. Because in African politics, the phrase, "we regret the loss of life," is never neutral. It is the language leaders use when they cannot deny the truth, but cannot afford to admit it either. Yet, even as the outrage grew, observers inside and outside Tanzania knew the AU was walking a tight line. Tanzania is central to East African stability, economically, geographically, politically. Condemnation could spark diplomatic fallout. Silence could destroy the AU's legitimacy. And so, amid this tense balance, citizens across Africa watched closely. From Nairobi to Lagos, people asked the same question. If a country like Tanzania, calm, stable, respected, can face such turmoil, then is any African democracy truly safe from its own shadows? The events of those first days after the election weren't isolated incidents. They were the eruption of a deeper fracture, one that had been quietly widening under the surface. And for the first time in decades, Tanzania's reputation couldn't shield it from the truth spilling into the streets. At sunrise on the fifth day after the election, the streets of Dar es Salaam looked strangely normal. Shops opening, buses, honking fishermen pulling their nets ashore. But beneath that thin layer of routine, something heavy was moving. People whispered more than they spoke. Mothers held their children closer. Young men checked their phones compulsively, waiting for the next video, the next name, the next body. The storm had already started. What came next was the thunder. That thunder was the African Union's Election Observation Mission report. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly in the language of diplomacy, polite, structured, carefully balanced. But sometimes the softest documents carry the loudest truths. And this one did. Embedded inside the report was a single line that shook Tanzania and the continent around it. The election did not comply with AU democratic principles. 7 calm-sounding words. 7 words that cracked open the illusion Dar es Salaam had been trying to project. Because the AU almost never says this. Not publicly, not officially, and certainly not about a country once considered a pillar of East African stability. As journalists and activists pored over the document, details emerged that painted a picture far darker than rumors alone. Observers reported intimidation at polling stations, including uniformed officers standing within feet of the ballot boxes. Ballot boxes arriving sealed but suspiciously heavy. Opposition agents denied entry to tallying centers for security reasons. Journalists harassed, equipment confiscated, and some quietly detained. Entire regions where turnout inexplicably dropped by half compared to previous elections. Each line pointed not to isolated errors, but to a coordinated system designed to control, not count votes. When the report hit social media, Tanzanians responded with a mix of pain and vindication. For many, it felt like someone was finally listening. For others, it was too little too late. As one commenter wrote, "We don't need validation. We need justice. And justice can't resurrect the dead." But the shock wasn't just national. It reverberated inside the AU itself. In Addis Ababa, diplomats argued behind closed doors. The old guard, the presidents who had ruled for decades, the men who feared that today's scrutiny could become tomorrow's precedent, pushed for caution. They warned that public criticism could destabilize East Africa and invite Western influence. But the younger diplomats, the ones who came of age during Nanar Ensar's Nayar Skufis must fall, and the Arab Spring, refused to stay quiet. They said unity without integrity was useless. Silence was complicity. And Africa could not keep demanding respect from the world while refusing to respect its own people. For the first time in years, Africa's continental body was split by something more profound than politics. It was split by values. Meanwhile, on the ground, reactions grew fiercer. University students in Arusha held candlelight vigils for those killed. Civil society groups began documenting abuses in real time, compiling footage, collecting testimonies, uploading encrypted files. Families who had remained silent out of fear started speaking openly on community radio and church gatherings. Pastors preached about truth buried under earth that refuses to stay buried. Imams called for national repentance. Tanzania's crisis had moved beyond the streets. It had entered the soul of the nation. The government, sensing the shift, doubled down. Officials dismissed the AU report as inaccurate, misinterpreted, or influenced by foreign NGOs. Police presence increased. More activists were arrested, some without warrants. State media ran hour-long segments portraying protesters as foreign-backed saboteurs. But the more the government insisted, the more ordinary citizens felt something was being hidden. Across Africa, conversations began to change. In Nairobi, student groups compared Tanzania's election to their own flawed ones. In Lagos, radio hosts asked whether Africa could ever escape political manipulation. In Accra, opinion writers praised the AU's rare honesty. Crisis in Tanzania had become a continental mirror, and yet even as this new awareness spread, the AU itself hesitated. The report was powerful but incomplete. It told the truth but offered no remedy. It exposed the wound but provided no treatment. And that vacuum, that silence, created space for the next dramatic escalation. If the AU would not act, someone else would. And as it turned out, that someone was not a foreign government or a Western institution. It was Tanzania's own opposition, ready to carry the battle beyond the continent and straight into the heart of international justice. On a quiet morning in Mwanza, an elderly woman named Rehema stood outside a small clinic, holding a photograph of her son, one of the protesters who never came home. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply waited, hoping that someone inside the clinic could tell her whether her boy had been treated, arrested, or buried. Scenes like hers played out across Tanzania in the weeks after the election. Ordinary citizens, once proud of their country's stability, now found themselves searching for answers in hospitals, morgues, and even police stations where officers refused to speak. These were the first and most devastating civil consequences, families suspended in uncertainty, unsure if their loved ones were missing, hiding, detained, or dead. As fear spread, communities across Tanzania changed overnight. Neighborhood groups that once gathered to share meals now met in secret to exchange information and warn one another about nighttime raids. Parents stopped allowing their teenagers to walk alone after sunset. Street vendors sold their goods quickly and went home early, avoiding areas where police trucks tended to pass. Trust, the quiet glue that held Tanzanian society together, began to crumble. Meanwhile, the political consequences were unfolding with equal force. The moment the AU report was released, CHADEMA, the main opposition party, made a decision that would reshape the nation's political landscape. They would not rely on Tanzanian institutions to deliver justice. Instead, they would go international, directly to the United Nations, directly to the International Criminal Court. It was a radical step almost unheard of in East Africa. Most political parties accept defeat even in flawed elections, fearing retaliation or further chaos. But CHADEMA did the opposite. They gathered evidence, like investigators building a criminal case, videos of security forces firing at unarmed crowds, drone footage of officers dragging bodies, medical reports detailing bullet wounds, timestamps of unlawful arrests, testimonies from families who saw loved ones taken away. This wasn't political theater, it was a legal offensive. Their submission to the ICC shook Tanzania's political elite to its core. Government officials accused the opposition of treason, of inviting Western meddling, of damaging the nation's image abroad. State TV broadcast emotional appeals, warning Tanzanians against turning their backs on sovereignty. The ruling party's spokesperson even claimed the ICC was a relic of colonial control. But these arguments fell flat because for the first time in years, it was Africans, not foreigners, who were asking the ICC to intervene. It was Tanzanian victims, Tanzanian lawyers, Tanzanian families demanding justice. That fact alone changed the entire moral equation. Yet this confrontation came with escalating costs. Politically, Tanzania entered a period of intense polarization. Parliament sessions grew hostile. Opposition members were threatened or temporarily barred from attending. Civil servants suspected of sympathizing with CHADEMA faced suspensions. Even religious leaders who spoke about truth and accountability were quietly warned to stay within the boundaries of national unity. Civically, the impact was even deeper. A wave of self-censorship swept across the country. Journalists turned off their cameras, bloggers deleted their posts, university professors avoided discussing politics in their classrooms. The message was clear: speaking out carried consequences, and still the fear didn't silence everyone. If anything, the attempt to suppress dissent pushed more Tanzanians toward activism. Youth groups created encrypted channels to share updates. Women's organizations organized discreet support networks for families of detainees. Lawyers formed volunteer teams to defend arrested protesters, often working through the night. In this tense environment, Tanzania became a symbol of a larger African dilemma. When governments fail their people, where can those people turn, and how long can a nation balance between the truth it fears and the justice it needs? These questions would soon fuel the next and even more consequential battle, one that would move beyond Tanzania's borders and test the very backbone of African leadership. From Washington to Brussels, from New York to Geneva, Tanzania's post-election crisis did not erupt into global headlines the way conflicts usually do. There were no urgent White House briefings, no dramatic debates on Capitol Hill, no emergency resolutions at the UN Security Council. But behind the quiet diplomats were watching closely. Because Tanzania was not just another African country in turmoil. It was the country everyone had always pointed to as the stable one. And when the stable one begins to shake, the world takes notice. In the United States, analysts within policy circles, particularly those in African affairs desks, viewed the crisis with a mixture of concern and déjà vu. Older American observers, especially those who lived through the Cold War, recognized the pattern: a government claiming stability, a population demanding truth, institutions caught in the middle, and an international community trying to decide whether to call it a domestic issue or a democratic emergency. The Biden administration, like previous U.S. administrations, tended to tread carefully with Tanzania. Washington values Tanzania for its strategic coastline, its growing economy, and its role in East African peacekeeping. Open criticism could threaten diplomatic ties, but turning a blind eye could signal to Africa and the world that human rights matter only when they are politically convenient. This dilemma created a quiet tension in American policy spaces. One senior analyst put it bluntly during a closed-door discussion: if Tanzania collapses publicly, it forces us to choose between our ideals and our interests. Across Europe, the reaction was even more complicated. The European Union, still recovering from its own internal divisions, saw Tanzania's turmoil as another reminder that democracy worldwide is becoming fragile. Some European lawmakers argued that supporting the AU's report was essential, an act of solidarity with African institutions finally finding their voice. Others warned that too much pressure could push Tanzania closer to China or Russia. But the most interesting reactions did not come from governments. They came from ordinary citizens across the world, and especially across Africa. Kenyan social movements drew parallels to their own contested elections. Nigerian activists saw echoes of their struggle against police brutality. Ghanaian commentators praised the AU's courage and questioned whether West Africa would ever reach the same level of institutional honesty. Even in South Africa, where political polarization runs deep, young analysts argued that Tanzania's crisis might become a template for how African democracies confront abuse in the digital age. What startled many Americans watching from afar was how young Africans, despite censorship and surveillance, managed to create their own narrative. They didn't wait for CNN or BBC to explain what happened. They live-streamed it, they documented it, they challenged it. The age of foreign media defining African truth is fading, replaced by a generation armed with phones, courage, and an unshakable belief that justice begins with visibility. This shift unsettled older power structures, including some in the U.S., because it meant Africa was no longer passively receiving international judgment. It was producing its own evidence, its own demands, and its own moral direction. And at the center of that shift was the African Union. To Americans observing the crisis, the AU's split response, congratulating Samia while condemning the election's irregularities, looked contradictory. But to Africans, it represented a deeper battle: the war between the AU's past and its future, between its old allegiance to heads of state and its new obligation to the people they govern. Washington's think tanks quietly acknowledged that this was the first real test of whether African institutions could hold African leaders accountable without U.S. intervention. A test of whether the continent could build its own moral compass rather than depending on pressure from Western capitals. In many ways, the world realized that Tanzania's election wasn't just Tanzania's crisis. It was a referendum on the credibility of African democracy and a preview of whether the 21st century will see Africa rise through accountability or sink deeper into political stagnation. In the end, Tanzania's 2025 election leaves us with a truth more unsettling than the violence itself: a democracy doesn't collapse in a single moment. It erodes quietly through fear, through silence, through institutions that forget who they were created to protect. What happened in Tanzania is not just the story of one leader or one party or one contested vote. It is the story of how fragile even the strongest reputations can be when accountability is treated as an inconvenience instead of a duty. Across the country, families are still searching for answers. Mothers still wait outside hospitals. Fathers still check police stations hoping to hear the name of a missing son. Youth who once believed their vote was their voice now ask whether their voice still matters at all. These are not political wounds, they are human ones. And human wounds have a way of echoing long after the speeches fade. What makes this moment so important is that Tanzania was never supposed to be here. If a nation celebrated for discipline, unity, and calm can descend into fear, then the rest of the continent must pay attention. Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, countries with their own delicate balances, have watched Tanzania's crisis like a mirror held too close. Because if the stable one is shaking, then what does that say about everyone else? This is where the African Union faces its greatest test in decades. If the AU chooses political comfort over moral clarity, the message to ordinary Africans will be unmistakable. Your suffering is negotiable, but if the AU stands firm, if it demands accountability from its own members, then Africa will step into a new era, one where truth is not borrowed from foreign governments, but built from within. And yes, other leaders across the continent are watching too. In West Africa, where figures like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso speak openly about sovereignty, justice, and people-centered leadership, Tanzania's crisis raises uncomfortable questions about the future of democracy in Africa. Will nations demand honesty from their governments, or will they continue pretending stability exists even when the foundations are cracking? The world is also watching quietly, carefully, and with a hint of disbelief. From Washington to Brussels, many older Americans who grew up witnessing major global shifts may feel a familiar warning. Democracies fall not when they are attacked from the outside, but when they lose their moral compass on the inside. And so the question now is not whether President Samia Suluhu Hassan will face political consequences or whether CHADEMA's petition will succeed in The Hague. The real question is much bigger. Will Africa finally choose to protect its people over its presidents? Will truth become an African value, not only an African aspiration? Before we close, I invite you to share your thoughts. Do you believe Africa's stable democracies are as stable as they appear on paper? When leaders silence their own people, should organizations like the AU call it sovereignty or call it hypocrisy? If you want to follow stories like this, stories that reveal the struggle, the courage, and the awakening happening across Africa, please subscribe. And if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, share this video so more people can understand what's unfolding behind the curtain of official statements.